Hello, everybody. Good afternoon from Rome. We are organizing this webinar of the International Anti-Fascist Trade Union Network from the CGIL headquarters in Rome. As you know, we are the organizers and founders of this network, and we are very happy of coordinating the activities of the networks until the end of this year. The International Anti-Fascist Trade Union Network is composed by affiliates of the European and International Trade Union Confederations in the four continents. We have trade union members from Africa, Asia, the Americas, and of course also from Europe. This is the third webinar in a row. We have decided to concentrate our attentions on the threat of the far right and how to counter the far right, in particular during the first webinar in the Americas. We have been talking about the upcoming European elections and the threat that Trump is putting on the progressive movement around the world. And then, of course, of the attacks, especially in Argentina, but also in other countries in the Americas where there is a lot of attacks on trade unions and activists in general, where there is normally authoritarian governments in place. Then we've been analyzing the situation in Europe. As you know, the European elections, our webinar took place before the European elections. We were already aware and also calling people to go to vote for progressive Europe, for a Europe that serves the people in terms of economic and social and, of course, civil rights and liberties. Today, we dedicated this webinar to Pride Month. We believe it's very important that the trade union movement around the globe says very clearly that there is no space at all for discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in trade unions and at the workplace. My colleague Sandro, who will be speaking afterwards, will say a few things about the action of CGIL in this field. Today, this afternoon at 6 p.m. in Rome, we will be protesting again and taking the streets. Some activists who were coming back from a demonstration the day before yesterday that we had organized against the constitutional reform of the Meloni government have been beaten violently by a neo-fascist group in Rome, in central Rome. These colleagues and comrades of the Students' Union affiliated to CGIL have had severe injuries, and this is only the last attack, the physical attack of neo-fascist mobs happening in Rome and in the country. This gives the sense also of the urgency of this meeting. There have been attacks against LGBTQI activists also at the occasion of Pride events in Rome, in Italy, and abroad, in Europe and beyond. LGBTQI parades are targeted by neo-fascist mobs and groups, and we believe that urgent action is needed. As the ITUC Global Rights Index demonstrates, it's been launched a few days ago, and it's already published on the website of the ITUC. Attacks against LGBTQI people at the workplace are on the rise. And there is also a serious risk and threat against what we call discrimination on several grounds, because our trade union LGBTQI activists are especially targeted because they are unionists and because they are LGBTQI people. And the context at the moment is very complicated. Unfortunately, you might have heard about the G7 conclusion in Italy this year. There has been a direct attack against the self-determination of women with the attempt to remove from the final declaration of the leaders of abortion rights for women and the words sexual orientation and gender identity have been scrapped out of the latest declaration, the version of the Declaration of the Leaders, only because the Italian far-right government was promoting its removal from the declaration. We strongly condemn these decisions, and we are afraid that the G7 are not leading in terms of paving the way for better living and working conditions of LGBTQI women and other discriminated groups at the workplace. The context is not good, but we try to resist, and this is the reason why we are here. And I am very happy to introduce you to our guests today. We have Daniel Bertosa, who is the General Secretary of PSI, the International Public Service Union. Thank you, Daniel. It's very much appreciated you're here, despite I know you are attending the Congress of the European Public Services Union. But it's very important that you are here because we think that together with the Council of Global Union, you are leading on defending LGBTQI people at the workplace. So thank you for being there and for your project. I'm sure you will tell us more in a while. We have Sandro, who is the new rights officer at CGIL, and will give the Italian but also European perspective on the issue we are talking about today. Thank you, Catherine Hugendubel, who is from ILGA Europe, the European branch of the ILGA world. It's very important to have you here. We go hands in hands with the civil society in Italy, in Europe, and in the world to fight this battle together. We will be joined in a while also by Jean Willis, who is a very well-known human rights activist in Brazil, but not only, all over the world. Without further ado, I thank you all for being here. I remind you that this is live streamed on Collective, also on YouTube, where you can have the live subtitles in other languages. Daniel, the floor is yours from Bucharest, if I'm not wrong. Thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure. I hope you can hear me well. I've had some internet connections. I'm on my phone, but I think we'll be fine. I did make a special effort to join because I think this is a very important initiative, particularly the joining of the connection of fascist movements and the ideological construction of some of the attacks that we're seeing. One of the things we've been speaking about here at this conference of European public service workers and their unions is the way in which the right is growing all around the world, and we've been talking about why that is, and particularly the increased anger that many of the working class are feeling. That is not necessarily directly driving some of these this hate and this reaction, but it's creating circumstances that are very fertile for the extreme right and for these fascist and pre-fascist organizations to recruit and mobilize in. So, for example, when ordinary workers feel that their public services aren't of the quality they want, or when they have precarious work, or when they just feel the society they live in is no longer serving their interests, that the people who are making the rules are doing it for their own reasons and not including the interests of working people, they get very angry. And they look for scapegoats, and they look for reasons why they're not feeling happy. And this is the environment that I think has enabled the growth of the reactionary right. And it's important that we combat the problems that creates, but also deal with the circumstances that create it. And for trade unions, that's particularly important for a range of reasons. One of which is because we are a mass-based movement. We have access to a lot of workers, and we are able to educate and to discuss these issues and connect these issues for them, and explain to them why these alternatives that are being promoted by the extreme right are false hopes. They're not actually what's wrong with our society. Because otherwise, what the risk is, and I think we're seeing this at the moment, we're seeing increased attacks on the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans community, And also we're seeing attacks on migrants. And that's really because the extreme right is able to construct this narrative of the other, of what a traditional society looks like, what a traditional family looks like, the way society would look if workers were safe, in some mythologized past. And so I think that they're quite linked, and we're seeing these extreme right movements paint these pictures and create these narratives all over the world. We've seen it in Turkey, we're seeing it in Russia, Brazil, the USA, Italy, where the attacks on migrants come with attacks on what they construct as traditional family lives, and also attacks on women who aren't deemed to fit this norm of what a normal, ordinary family is. And that's very, very dangerous ideological territory, but it's enabled because of the general unhappiness of much of the working class for a wide range of reasons. And precisely because that trade union has got a really important role to play. Firstly, because workplace safety is important. Non-discrimination in the workplace is important. People spend a lot of their time in the workplace. And if they aren't safe in the workplace, and if they are discriminated against in the workplace, then clearly a lot of their day is in an unsafe environment. But also the potential to access their well-being and income is lower. It's also important for visibility. One of the things that I think we've seen with the LGBTQ movement in the last 20 or 30 years is once there's safeness, then there's visibility. And people realize that actually there are a lot of LGBTQ people in my workplace, and actually it becomes normalized. And I think that's a very, very important thing for trade unions to insist upon, that people can be who they need to be and who they are in the workplace. For us as public service trade unions, it's also doubly important because access to public services is critical for everybody to fulfill their basic needs, particularly when you're in a vulnerable part of the community. Access to healthcare, the ability to be visible and be open about who your partner is when it comes to accessing welfare rights or pension rights, to deal with reproductive issues. These are all parts of public services that people need to be able to access. So availability to public services is absolutely critical. And that's assisted by having a workplace that's diverse. Public services that are provided by workers who reflect the community is really important for access for the community. And then the last reason why unions are really critical is because we build power. The business of unions is to build power for justice, and we need to be lending our power to those movements. If I could just say also, I don't think this is irreversible. And one of the reasons why I think the circumstances that create this sort of pre-fascist era we're in are actually reversible is because I don't think it's the case that the working class have suddenly become more hateful, or the working class has suddenly become anti-women or homophobic or anti-trans. What we've seen, for example, in a place like Brazil, is we've seen people go from Lula to Bolsonaro, so very angry, very hateful, and then back to Lula. We've seen in the US the population go from Obama to Trump and then back to Biden. And so I think I think it would be wrong to say there is a groundswell of hatred and anger. I think what we're seeing is the conditions being created for unhappiness, and that being capitalized by the organized right wing. And that's why the trade unions have to lend their support and their power to all of the fights that we face. If I can just spend a few minutes now talking about what the unions have been doing, or what the global union federations have been doing. We in our own unions have been raising these issues with leaders. And because there are a lot of trade union leaders who intuitively are supportive of this work, but they don't necessarily understand how to make it real in their union. They may not understand how to talk to their members or their leadership about some of these issues. So we have initiated a project to help out the trade union affiliates we have, and we have 670 affiliates in 160 countries, to talk to them about the importance of these issues, why they're important for unions, and how they can work with their own leaders and activists to sensitize and educate their members. I wouldn't say that that has necessarily been at all times easy. We also have to acknowledge that trade unions have some work to do themselves, and that not all of our leaders and not all of our members are always comfortable with these issues. But I think we have seen a shift. In some ways, we're very proud of this work, but in some ways, the fact that we are leading this globally, and we have been for the last 2 or 3 years, shows how late actually some of the unions have been in dealing with some of these issues. And so we are seeing a shift. We've seen the other global union federations that we work with come on board. We've been supported by the teachers and the transport workers and the food workers unions who've been supporting us in leading this work. But we're also seeing other unions, federations globally, shift in their perspectives on this work. And I think that's very important and very powerful. It is contextually based. So there are parts of the world where this work is easier, and there are parts of the world where the issues are different. We know, for example, that there are still many countries in the world where homosexuality is criminalized, and promoting homosexuality is criminalized. And so we need to be sensitive to the fact that in those countries, we need to do more education. We need to be working with leaders in different ways. In other parts of the world, we're fighting the backlash. We're holding the ground. We're taking a much more zero tolerance approach. And there's perhaps the need less for education as it is for building power and normalizing. Also, as unions, we're looking for the sectors where we can make the fastest progress. There are certain sectors of the workforce where visibility is higher, and where we find leaders who are much more interested in taking the work on and using those unions to create visibility in those countries. We've also got a fair bit with our own staff, and I think this is quite important. Trade unions are not LGBT activist organisations. They're organisations that believe in justice. But not everybody on our staff, even though their political commitment might be there, really understands how to mainstream this work into their work, how to talk about these issues. Perhaps they're not completely comfortable defending the issues, or they might feel judged if they're using the wrong language. And so for us internally, it's been very, very important to train our own staff, and then to have our staff train our affiliates' leadership, and for them to train their own staff. So I think that that's probably all I need to say to begin with. I'll finish by saying the most gratifying thing for us now is that we're now able to take a step back, and some of the other trade unions, global union federations who we've been working with, particularly in Latin America, but also in Asia, and some of the other sectoral unions are now stepping up. And so we're transferring some of the leadership that we've been involved in for the last few years to the international food workers, who are now pushing forward, and we'll be supporting their work. And that broadening of the support is very gratifying, because it means that the work we've been doing will become more mainstream, more ingrained into everyday union work, and it's moved outside of the public services, where, as I said before, there is perhaps a more natural, or the work is easier. So the fact that it's going into food workers, agricultural workers, and that the International Union of Food Workers is now going to lead some of that work, and that the transport workers are getting on board, I think that shows that this shift is possible, and that trade unions can lead the way, can be allies, and can be part of a movement that fights back against the specific incidences of transphobia and homophobia, but can also work with a wide range of groups, including the LGBTQ community and the trans community and the migrant community, to change the circumstances that we're facing in the world at the moment, that are making the mobilization of the far right just that much easier. So thank you very much. Happy to engage a little bit further as we go.
Thank you, Daniel, for this initial words from you. I'm not sure you can stay until the Q&A. We're going to have, after the 4 speakers, Q&A. Well, I think, first of all, as you are the only global leader, let me celebrate Thailand that approved equal marriage this week. I think it's a very important step that Thailand took. It's the third Asian country, if I'm not wrong, to approve marriage equality, and a very important symbolic decision by the country. I retain two very strong messages from you that are very useful, Daniel. First of all, it's we are here to build power for justice, you said. I think this is a very important message. We do that as a trade union movement together with the civil rights NGOs, and this is why we are very happy that ILGA Europe is here with us today. We are mass organizations, people that unite the people. You know, we are working to make people to come together, and this is what the far right hates. The far right hates unions, hates NGOs, because we deliver a collective message. They want people to be individualized and fragmented, and they want people in despair to be left alone with their own problems. This is why they hate us. The second message that I retain from your speech is a message of hope. You said it's not irreversible. And this is true. This is true because even only in 2 years in Italy, also, I think, thanks to the demonstrations, strikes, activism of Italian unions, but also the different communities that are at risk of discrimination in this country because of the far right. In the last European election, the Meloni government lost 1.2 million votes compared to 2 years ago. So yes, this is irreversible, but we need political parties that deliver on this agenda. And I think this is one of the main demands that we have for a CGIL. But Sandro will tell us more about our action. Sandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salvatore. Hi, everyone. And the New Rights Office was initially created in CGIL to combat discrimination against LGBTQ people in the workplace. It was between the 1980s and 1990s and still represents a unique example in the European and global trade union panorama. Over the years, the office has dealt with the relationships between the Catholic Church and the state in Italy and its influence on discrimination. At this moment, the focus of the office is on the secularity of the state and on the rights of the person and self-determination. We do this from a holistic perspective, try to do it in a holistic perspective, trying to have not only a trade union approach, but also a broader vision and a cultural perspective. In dealing with the topic of secularism, the issue of the rights of LGBTQ+ people is obviously central, but is not the only issue we address. The issues we address range from reproductive rights and related medically assisted procreation pathways to issues relating to people's end-of-life choices and sex workers' rights to self-determination, for giving any examples. In all cases, secularism and self-determination are the principles that guide us. The Office New Rights carries out a political function at the national level and is present at the local level through its offices. The national office leads strategies at the national level, starting from some consideration. The first, there is a constant increase in cases of harassment and discrimination in the workplaces. The second one, this type of discrimination is highly underestimated. The third, the fear that reporting this discrimination could worsen the situation in the workplace and lead to retaliation often leads to failure to report these situations. From the point of view of government policies, as Salvatore mentioned, the climate has worsened significantly in recent years. The arrival of the far-right government has worsened the climate, especially towards same-sex families and trans people. The action of our organization is first and foremost a trade union action in a strict sense, which involves intervention in the workplaces and collective bargaining that recognize rights to those who by law are not entitled to them. But we also carry out a more general action through the participation and organization of moments of debate and dissemination, and the function of soliciting more advanced political position towards the government and parliament. As we were saying, in this specific historical moment, the function of an instance of this type within the largest Italian and European trade union represents an important safeguard. The extreme and neo-fascist right-wingers who are taking power in Italy and in many parts of the world make the rollback of sexual and reproductive rights and the battle against the LGBTQ+ community one of their watchwords. This is nothing new. A study by the European Parliament Forum in 2018 already highlighted this project, tracing it back to the groups that referred the so-called Europe Agenda and to the document titled Restoring of the Natural Order. The starting date of this obscurantist counteroffensive can be identified in 2013, when a small group of European and North American activists began to develop strategies that could push back sexual and reproductive rights in Europe after a season of great openings and great achievements. Under attack are not only the rights recently won by the gay, lesbian, and trans community, but all rights related to sexuality and self-determination, from those of older acquisitions such as divorce and contraception, to abortion and euthanasia. The attack, in short, is on the right to self-determination, the same that the office I represent is trying to defend. And this attack appears as one of the characteristics of new fascism, much more than it happens with old symbols. The first step that this group takes is the creation of a blog entitled Europe Agenda, which until 2017 remains the only source from which it's possible to obtain information on the roads traveled. The characteristic of the group is in fact that of the most rigid secrecy and anonymity. The focus of the annual meetings of the group is clearly to identify the areas of action and interests, however, always relating to people's sexual and reproductive rights and the related strategies to pursue the organization's goals. Starting from the 2015 meeting, the main thematic areas and the related action strategies were outlined through the identification of three macro areas: marriage and family, right to life, anti-discrimination. The laws to be repealed, those to be approved, and the other necessary actions were consequently identified. The strategy was also refined through the use of a vocabulary borrowed from pro-rights activism and reversed against it. Therefore, they no longer talk about prohibition or something similar, but about rights and discrimination. They talk about anti-Christian discrimination, about the demand for freedom of thought and moral judgment to justify hate speech against LGBTQ people, the recommendation to members to use the word sodomy to define LGBTQ groups, the rights of children to receive correct information about sodomy, the right of fathers to prevent abortion, the right of parents to educate their children without interference, the right of Christians to violate the law for moral reasons, the so-called conscientious objection, a strategy that has unfortunately produced results on the European continent. Exponents of this international network of reactionaries and fundamentalists have penetrated the institution that deal with sexual and reproductive rights. In many countries, referendums have been promoted against same-sex marriage. Considerable limits have been introduced on the right to abortion. In Italy, for example, the far-right government introduced the possibility for the pro-life association to be present in family advisory centers where women practice voluntary termination of a pregnancy. Conscientious objection has been increasingly favored also through the promotion of legal cases, and in many countries, the Istanbul Convention has not been ratified. There was frequent use of false news, such as the accusation that IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Federation, was illegally using fetal tissue and selling human organs. The investigation into the origin of the financing of these groups is not secondary. We find ourselves faced with a mix of exponents linked to the far right, to Catholic, Orthodox, and evangelical religious circles, or to countries that are not clear from a financial and democratic point of view. I close this brief dissertation with a question. Is it still possible to think that fascism manifests itself with the characteristics of 20th century dictatorships, or should we instead recognize this phenomena, which perhaps arise from a popular investiture, as in the case of the so-called democratorships, as new fascism, and keep ourselves to fight them on that terrain? I wouldn't want our rights to disappear one by one while we wait at the window to watch the March on Rome pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandro, for these words. I forgot to mention before that there is a Council of Global Unions webinar that is being organized on these issues on the 26th of June, and we will circulate this invitation to the International Anti-Fascist Radio Network. Sandro, your excellent intervention made it clear there is a very clear link, as you said, between the far-right groups, religious extremists, and also other groups that are allied to fight against us, against unions, and against the LGBTQI people and communities. And that they are a real threat, as I said at the beginning, with people being aggressed and being attacked by mobs in the streets. There is indeed a lot of work to do also in terms of investigating the financial resources for these groups to exist and to perform their violence. It's very difficult, as Catherine will maybe tell us, these days to fundraise on issues like LGBTQI rights. So the source of finances of these far-right groups give us a very clear indication of who supports them and who makes these groups thrive. Catherine, I'll give you the floor with also a question. Is there awareness among the ILGA Europe and beyond, maybe at the international level, members, affiliates, about the concrete threats that the far right is posing us? And do you envisage or already carry out any actions in the near future? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to the trade union movement, but also to CGL in particular. We're really keen to have these conversations, and we already in the past have worked a lot here in Brussels, but also globally with the trade union movement. Because I think if one thing that comes through already in the other interventions, but has been really clear in our work, is that facing the attacks that we're seeing at the moment, facing the increasing global coordinated movement, which is basically attacking human rights, democracy, and rule of law globally, we need to be stronger in building alliances, for example, between LGBTI and women's rights organizations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but also amongst other allies and the trade union movement. You asked me if there is an awareness. I think it's been really striking how a few years back we heard more and more about member organizations talking about, attacks, referendums against same-sex partnership recognition, referendums for defining marriage in the constitution as a union between women and men, and always feeling that these were attacks actually driven by local family organizations. But if you then looked at the campaign slogans, if you looked at the images that were used, they were the same ones that were popping up all over the place. And so it was actually, we were very quick, and actually I think it was quite good to see how these things are interlinked, how they're interlinking to, it was already mentioned also, religious organizations, how, already in 2014 in Croatia, Opus Dei played a big role in working together with organizations on a referendum against advancing family and partnership rights, for example. Since then, there's been a lot of studies going on, also looking at the financing that you mentioned. Now, of course, the financing that's going to those groups compared to what the LGBTI movement across Europe and Central Asia, the region that we as ILGA Europe represent, is completely disproportionate. So yes, we need to be stronger together to actually have something to counter that. It's been said already, it's a really critical time that we're at the moment. The rise in the far right is quite obvious across Europe now as well, but also really the rise in hate that we've seen at ILGA Europe is unprecedented. Each year in February, we issue something that we call the annual review, where we get reports from all our member organizations across 54 countries on what has been happening over the last 12 months. And 23 was the first year when we had to say this was the most violent year reported for the LGBTI community. Most violent, not only in number of incidences, but also in intentionality and severity of attacks. So going to killings as well, but also, and I think that's important to keep in mind as well, the suicide rates, especially amongst young LGBTI people, have gone up drastically. And that's another reflection of the hate, of the very hateful and polarized public discourse that we're seeing, and the targeted attacks against rights. Unfortunately, it's also a time when we really see more and more politicians and also more and more governments across Europe playing into that polarization and using hate speech against the community themselves. We've seen how across our region, LGBTI people have been used as scapegoats, how human rights, and especially very often migrants and LGBTI people, have been pulled into the middle of what the opposition calls a cultural war, to rally up their own voters. But what we're seeing is that this is giving space for more hate online and offline, but also for real violence, hurting people in the streets. Ahead of the EU elections at ILGA Europe, we had a press release where we were warning that basically Europe is not prepared for the onslaught of a growing far-right political governing in Europe. And what we meant by that is that one instrument to prepare yourselves and to protect minorities, to protect human rights, and also, the LGBTI community, is having proper laws in place. Laws, legislation that protects people, that is the last place of resort when times become hard. And we've seen, many of you mentioned abortion rights. We've seen how, only very recently now, activists have worked very strongly to get, for example, in France, the right to abortion in the constitution. And that's because they didn't trust that the law they had would hold. We've all seen what happened in the US with the clear right to abortion established by the Constitutional Court and how that fell. So laws are really important. We've seen in Italy, for example, how quickly backlash against the community can happen when we have this legal vacuum. LGBTQIA Europe we have a benchmark of laws protecting the LGBTI community. We call the Rainbow Map. I'll post the link after my intervention in the chat. And Italy has been one of the lowest countries in Europe on protecting LGBTI rights. So with lots of gaps on adoption rights, on properly secured legal gender recognition based on self-determination in many areas. What we've seen since the Meloni government came into place, and especially over the last 12 months, is really targeted attacks against the community. We've seen the deregistration of lesbian mothers in some regions in Italy. We've seen attempts to cut back on support for trans children in schools. We've seen attempts to limit access to trans-specific healthcare. And all of that could happen quite quickly because the legal protections were not in place. And when other leaders supporting LGBTI rights met with the Italian government, they were told, I don't know what you're talking about. We're not changing any laws. We're not doing anything against the LGBTI community. So laws really matter. And I think it really matters that all of us, civil society, trade unions, actually keep pushing forward on that. We also really need to be aware on how unprecedented the attacks are. And I think it might be worth talking about what we've seen happening in Russia over the last 12 months. I mean, this has been happening for a long time, but what we see now is that end of last year, Russia criminalized the LGBTI movement. Russia banned legal gender recognition for trans people, as well as access to trans-specific healthcare. And these bans on legal gender recognition are unfortunately, worryingly becoming a thing. So we've seen Hungary ban legal gender recognition in 2020. We've seen Bulgaria ban it in 2023, and we've seen now Russia ban it. So what we're saying is we need to pay close attention to these new tools of oppression, like the Russian criminalization of a whole segment of society, and these outright bans on legal gender recognition. I think what we need to keep in mind is that what the opposition, so what those working, for a different vision of the European Union, not based on fundamental rights, for a different vision of society, a restalling of traditional orders, as it's often called, are trying to do, is divide and conquer. We've seen as the LGBTI community, and it was mentioned as well, an extreme rise in hate against trans people. And very often, unfortunately, this is driven from a parent women's rights perspective. So very often an opposition is created between women's rights and LGBTI rights and trans rights specifically. The end goal is to actually do away with women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, and LGBTI rights all the same. There is no support for women's rights in a transphobic agenda, but it comes in this mantle, and I think that's the really dangerous thing, and that's where we've been really actively working to counter that through alliances with women's rights organizations, through making very clear that you cannot do this in our name. Feminists who claim to be transphobic are no feminists at heart, because challenging the gender hierarchy is at the core of all our work. And this brings me to what is it we all can do more? And I want to close with that. So one thing is active allyship and you know, taking a visible stance in these critical times we're seeing. And it's really great to see how many governments have been stepping up, many politicians have been stepping up, but also trade unions have been, I think, making a huge leap to just being more out there together with us. Now, this year, on the 17th of May, on the Ida Hobbit Day, we've seen the European Trade Union Federation issuing a very clear statement that was supported by EPSU, by Industrial, by many, many trade union federations across Europe. But also like in joining prides, for example, and I don't mean prides in, you know, Brussels Pride. It's great to join Brussels Pride. In Turkey, prides have been practically banned for over 10 years now. So are we showing up together where the actual right to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression is tackled? Because that actually means protection for people and it makes a real difference for human rights. You asked me what are we doing against the backlash, against the organized anti-gender campaigns. I think very importantly, there was a raising awareness that these are not local attacks by concerned parents or by concerned women, but these were instrumentalized groups that were actually, and there were big machines of campaigns and a lot of money behind it in whichever country legal change, for example, was happening. But the other thing we're saying is there are actually two very important things we need to do. The one thing is to continue to move forward. So our key work still is to work with governments and to work with organizations to push governments to actually move forward legal protection. We've seen, for example, in Spain, where there was a big organized campaign against a new law on including many advances on women's rights, but also trans rights, for example. And the Spanish government held course. They were wobbling. There were divisions within the government, whether to drop that law or not. But we managed all together to keep that legislative track going forward. And I think that's so key. And that's where also trade unions can help us play a decisive role on what to do. And the other thing is to keep fostering social acceptance. I think we need to be aware, especially in what I call this attempts to divide different groups of society and play them out against each other, that very often people just don't know yet. Why are trans rights such an easy target at the moment? It's because many of us still don't know enough about trans people, about their rights, and have questions that often might be in good intention. They're not to cut down on trans rights, but there are real questions. And I think opening up those spaces again to have safe and respectful conversations. So I'm not talking about hateful, polarized online back and forth, exchanges on X or Instagram. But what we've been doing at LG Europe, we've been, for example, ahead of the elections, meeting with all the big European party families. So the Greens, the Left, the Liberals, also the EPP, to say, you will get these attacks in the campaigns and let's talk through trans rights. Here's a space to actually ask your questions, to be better prepared to be an active ally for the trans community and the LGBTI community. So I think we just a very practical little thing is we're more than happy to be in touch with all of you to see if there's also a space maybe for such a conversation within your own associations, because I think that's what we all need to really be stronger allies and move stronger forward together. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Catherine, for your excellent contribution to the debate today. You said there is a very clear rise in hate. And this is demonstrated by the annual review that you publish. It would be very interesting, and this is maybe something we can work on together in the future, to observe that the rise in hate that you describe in the sphere of discrimination against the LGBTQIA+ community has a common trend together with the ITUC Global Rights Index. Threats against unionists and members are increasing. And Turkey is the perfect example. That authoritarian government not only prohibited Pride Parade, but it also prohibits every single year May Day demonstrations in Taksim Square in Istanbul. They arrest, torture, and kidnap even activists from the trade union movement and the LGBTQIA community. Turkey is the perfect example that the global leadership should repeal and not follow when it comes to deterioration of social and civil rights that go hands in hands. Then I found it very interesting what you said, and we believe it's very much true, that not necessarily there is a direct attack on civil liberties and rights. This is something that also Sandro mentioned. For instance, the Italian government, like others, is not necessarily intervening directly in abolishing abortion law, or it's not about changing the legislation, for sure, not for good, not to improve it. They will act rather on a more subtle way by, for instance, putting excessive administrative burden in accessing some services, or, for instance, in organizing a legal strike. In Italy, it's become very difficult to organize a legal strike these days because you will have administrative intervention, not because they have changed on the legislation. So we have to be very careful about this the sneaky way of the far right to undermine on our rights. And as Jean Willis is not able to join us today, I will put a direct question to Daniel and then ask all other people in the room to take the floor. Daniel, there is not a ghost, but an elephant in the room when we talk about this, because cuts to public services under the austerity waves that we've been going through in the different last decades have been a threat in terms of access of people to services. And when I think, for instance, of trans special services in hospitals, there are special sections for people with gender dysphoria, and they need to get access to those services to perform their transition in a legal and safe way, which is very important, the safety of the process. There is really an obstacle these days in more and more countries to trans people to access these services. And this is the result and immediate the immediate result of actions taken by the far right and, unfortunately, neoliberal governments inspired by austerity. So I think there is a link here, as Catherine was saying. What do you suggest? Is there more space for cooperation?
Absolutely. I mean, I know I'm going to have to get going in a few minutes, but I'm glad that you've asked this question now before I have to leave. The two are completely connected. And one of the things that neoliberal governments have been doing, pro-market governments have been doing, is starving public services so they can privatize them. And the problem with privatized services or services that are starved is that people, they're not very good. And people get angry about the fact that their public services are neither universally accessible nor of the quality that they would expect. But what they can't answer with this is that, oh, that's because we've privatized them to our corporate friends, or that's because the wealthy don't want to pay their taxes. And so it's important that there are alternative narratives. For them, it's important there are alternative narratives as to who's to blame for this. The migrants, the LGBTQ people who are taking up these services, or women who need reproductive rights services. They need alternative answers to cover what they've been doing. And so I think the narrative building around this is very deliberate, and it's designed to divide. And it's particularly harmful because then it creates the hate. And it creates the cover for these administrative burdens, and it makes it easier to stop those services that people need. And I think we're beginning to see the rollback of some of these services in the community, and some of them are very direct. We can talk about sort of trans medical procedures and services, but I think somebody also mentioned mental health. I think it's really important to acknowledge that mental health burden falls upon people who suffer stigmatization and discrimination. It's often hidden. It's doubly hidden. But also issues like housing and the ability to access welfare benefits or pension rights. These are all areas that if we allow these administrative burdens to creep in, they create barriers for people and make them feel even more excluded. If I can just finish, because I may not be able to stay much longer. The last speaker from ILGA also said something that I think is absolutely essential, and it's very simple, but we must come back to this again and again and again. Respectful, direct conversations. I was at university in the early 90s, and I was involved as an ally in my country in early what we called gay and lesbian at the time. The big debate was whether or not bisexual people should be included into that, or whether there was a place for allies. So we've come a long way. But I was involved in some of that early work, and even as an ally, you didn't always feel like you understood everything, or there wasn't the visibility. And so working class people who understand intuitively what it feels like to be vulnerable and have an intuitive allyship don't necessarily always feel confident or feel comfortable. And so I think having space for these discussions in a respectful way is absolutely essential. And that unfortunately does require a bit of an extra burden on the community, because it means that the community has to have these conversations, and it shouldn't be the LGBT community who has to do this. But I think as a political activist, we all understand that sometimes we have to do a little bit extra, and we have to lead these conversations, and we need to be doubly careful that they are respectful, and that people don't feel stupid for asking questions that expose their ignorance, because I think every person that is intuitively supportive but doesn't quite have the answer or hasn't been exposed to some of these issues, when they understand it, becomes a powerful ally. And so the things that were being said from the comrade from ILGA, I think, are really essential. And I think unions can play a part in that. I think, workplace conversations, the conversations you have in the workplace, are very, very important in increasing that sort of baseline acceptance and understanding. Because the things that I was grappling with in the 90s are now, my kids talk about openly and without any help. It's become normalized. And I think that also creates a very powerful, what's the word, sort of bulwark. It creates a shield to regressive moves. You don't have to convince my kids why discrimination against trans people is wrong, because for them it's just normal. It's been normalized because they've become familiar with that. And we can look at these attacks, and they're horrible, and the increase in violence is awful, but we should never underestimate sort of the latent support from the last generation, who just understand intuitively these issues and just will immediately defend in workplaces, in schools, and on the streets. That's the situation we want to get to. And I think the points that were made about having respectful, direct conversations in everyday life, it seems simple and it seems basic, but that's what political organizing has always involved. That's what socialists and popular fronts were doing in the 20s and the 30s to fight fascism. That's what we need to be doing now, and we should never underestimate the power of that.
Thank you, Daniel, so much for connecting with us in a precarious condition, but your messages are very well understood. And your last message, I can only complete by saying that CGIL, together with the resistance movement, already defeated fascism once, and we will defeat it and fight it in the future and be successful in this fight. I have two hands in the room raised, so I think it's time for Q&A, for you to take the floor and put questions or reflections. My message before giving the floor, and as a reaction, maybe later if Catherine wants to come back to this, I think it's a high time for anti-fascists and pro-human LGBTQI rights to put their face open in the society and fight openly this fight. The neo-fascists are very aggressive and very present. I think we have to show them that there is people which are organizing around anti-fascism and the right to self-determination and the fight against all forms of discrimination, especially against the LGBTQI. This is one of the reasons why this network exists. We want to be vocal and visible, like the LGBTQI community, vocal and visible about our rights, but also about the need to fight for good against the far right. Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I just really want to thank the CGIL for bringing this group of people together for this discussion. Just quickly, I'm Jeffrey Boyd. I'm the campaigns director for the IUF, the Global Trade Union Federation for Food Workers. I also coordinate our LGBTI work. I am queer myself. And I am also the chair of the Council of Global Unions LGBTI coordinating committee. And I wanted to make 3 points. One, just on what Danny was talking about in terms of public services. I was having a discussion yesterday with the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. And we were talking about the religious right in the US and their funding of anti-LGBTI organizations in Africa. And he was, the UN independent expert was talking about how specifically in Uganda, part of why the religious right has been so effective in pushing the Ugandan government for such truly terrible anti-LGBTI legislation in that country is that the funding that those religious groups are receiving from the US is basically, it comes with the expectation that they will lobby against LGBTI people, but the money essentially is used to provide social services for the church members because the state is in fact unable to provide the public services that the people need. And so the religious right in the US funds essentially public services for church members in Uganda in exchange for sort of actively pursuing an anti-LGBTI agenda. And I just think that connection around the funding, public services, anti-LGBTI legislation, we need to understand better sort of how those networks and funding streams are working and to fight them, I think, much more actively. The second point I want to make briefly, just in terms of the work that the IUF is doing around LGBTI workers and allies, we have a 4-point program that we're running. The first is around work with transnational companies to negotiate global agreements protecting LGBTI workers. We believe that having that language in contracts, collective bargaining agreements is critical. Particularly when, at the national level, legislation can move in all sorts of crazy directions. The second area is around training and education. We're doing a lot of trainings throughout the IUF, including one, to Danny's point, on LGBTI basics to basically enable our affiliates to come in and ask any questions they have about what the LGBTI community is. Why does the union care about it? Why is it important in a truly safe space where people can sort of learn about these issues? The third is advocacy, lobbying in the countries where we have strong affiliates that can actually push forward pro-LGBTI legislation. How do we actively support those affiliates in doing that? And then finally, coalition building is our fourth point, and we work very closely with ILGA. Really appreciated your comments, Katrine. And I think the trade union movement alone could use a lot of help from local LGBTI organizations all around the world to figure out how to drive our agenda together. And we are working with our affiliates in lots of different countries and with ILGA to sort of bring together local unions and local LGBTI organizations. I did a really wonderful set of meetings in Guyana between our affiliates and local Guyanese LGBTI organizations. So I do think the coalition building is super important. And then my final point, next week, June 26th, the Council of Global Unions LGBTI Initiative is hosting a webinar on the intersection of LGBTI rights and the freedom of association. I'll put the link in the chat. 2 p.m. on the 26th with the UN Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Freedom of Association and trade unionists from around the world. It's a 1-hour event. Really hope you can all be there. Thank you very much for the floor.
Thank you, Jeffrey. There was a lot on the floor, on the table. So maybe, Catherine, you want to take the floor and
yeah, I can come in with a few comments on what I heard. I think there was a important point also before about services and precarity of services and kind of how different groups are being played out against each other. And I think it's really important again to be very clear and united about that. I think one thing we've been seeing both during COVID, but also moving forward, and for example, also in countries like Ukraine, very increasingly now, is how very often the community is still falling completely off when it comes to mainstream service provision, unfortunately. And that's because of, discrimination will actually mean people are not reaching out to services. We've seen that in the homelessness sector, for example, where we've done a survey between our members, but also organizations providing homelessness services on how there's a mismatch and how very, very often LGBTI organizations themselves try to reinvent themselves, providing shelter, providing, for example, food banks during the COVID crisis, because the community in certain countries still feels they cannot access mainstream services. So I think even there's still a lot we could work on together. I think, again, also debunking myths like around, for example, we hear that so often now, how all of a sudden everything is about trans people, which is a really striking argument, and how the resources are going there and not taken away from other services, when actually that is not what's happening. Like the financing for the services wasn't there in the first place, and we see how our healthcare services, for example, are being more and more dismantled overall. So it's an example of the scapegoating that I mentioned before. I think these were my points. And one thing I wanted to say also, because we talk a lot, obviously, about discrimination in the workplace and kind of how unions can tackle that. What we're seeing as well, and for example, also from data that's from the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, is how access to employment is still a huge, huge issue for especially trans and intersex and non-binary people. So I know it's a bit hard to divert trade unions' attention to that, because your job is to represent the people, the workers. But I think, like, if we can make that more of a discourse. I think one question to Jeffrey specifically, and I'm sure you're doing this, is how far these conversations around LGBTI rights are also very specifically including trans activists, and I think especially intersex activists, because I think that's very often where we still see knowledge dropped dramatically, but we also see the real engagement of people once they are made aware, and once, I think especially around the intersex community, once people are starting to realize what's still happening to intersex children, for example, in the medical sector, because we don't have bans on intersex medical genital mutilation, we can actually activate and we can get a lot done. So I think that also being explicit about these things is something that's very, very helpful. I'll leave it here. I see other people coming in, and I'm very happy to come in at a later stage again.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Before I give the floor to Mario, I would like to mention that we had, I think, a very, very worrying example of scapegoating at the highest possible level last year during the ILO conference in Geneva, when, and maybe some people will remember that some countries, some governments of the countries present during the International Labour Conference tried to stop the budget of the ILO from being adopted, because there was an ILO project on LGBTQIA people and workers in the budget and in the agenda of the ILO for this year, 2024. And you will all remember that this was already the case for many years, and that item in the budget is in this year's budget. So it's clear that last year there was a group of countries in the ILO using the LGBTQI community as an instrument for a different kind of a fight and battle. And we find it particularly shameful that the right of a group of citizens that they should also represent, despite their horrible laws, are being used as an instrument to fight on other levels. They're using the LGBTQI community and workers to fight battles on other grounds. And I think we've been able to repeal this last year, and we have to do and continue the battle in the upcoming years. Mario, you have the floor.
Hi to everyone. Hi, comrade. Thank you for the floor. And I have not answer. I have a reflection. The fascism is not just an idea. The fascism is not an idea. Is not only an idea of hate. We must show that fascism materially affects our bodies, materially affect our lives, state borders, our wages. In Italy, this concept is still not clear. This is why the Rainbow Movement, unlike trade union, still has a narrow vision, a vision that does not articulate our lives at 360 degrees in society. We want to talk about the problems that cross-cut with our lives daily. The restrictive policies of the Meloni government, both on the economic side and on the rainbow rights side, are increasingly distancing Italian citizens also from the idea of a Europe of progress, from a Europe of people's rights and of fairness and equality among European citizens. It starts from endorsement of new neuropsychiatrists on gender theory, who deny therapy to transgender children, to the non-recognition of children born within same-sex couples. The measures on assisted reproductive technology or surrogacy are far from the government's agenda. The abortion's right is on regression. How much does the right to abortion impact on a F2M person in the event of an unwanted pregnancy? How much of an impact on the rainbow communities' rights to health when the government does dismantling public health system and gender or sexually transmitted diseases clinics. The impact is a class impact that exacerbates inequalities within inequalities. Today is the International Day of Refugees, an attack also on the rights of rainbow migrants when the government last year removed gender identity and sexual orientation from possibility for rainbow person to obtain a special protection in case of persecution in their country of origin. In this globalized society and the labor market, in these great climatic and socioeconomic migrations, in this restriction and the limitation of human rights, in this escalation of conflicts, the government's agenda is dividing Italy into many dissonant autarchies. An economic involution that divides the country between the rich and poor, that it produced serious differentiation in civil rights, that it limits the right to migrate, that destroys public system, that increases social inequalities in society and in the workplace. So it exacerbates rainbow discrimination too. And for this reason, we must to have an approach in a sense of intersectionality. So I have no question, I have reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario, especially for mentioning two additional aspects. First of all, we are very much concerned about the increase of conflicts and wars all over the world. This is also affecting not only trade unions, but also the LGBTQIA community, as there is increasing discrimination. And of course, the world of work is heavily affected by the number of conflicts arising around the world. And second, for mentioning International Refugees Day, I think that the reference you made to the limitation of asylum seekers to ask refuge also on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity or expression is one of the main concerns we have in terms of far right re-regulating the migration agendas. We're particularly increased. CGIL has issued a press release to protest heavily against the EU Migration Pact. That includes also on worries that are founded on possible discrimination in access to asylum and refugees' rights. So thank you for mentioning that. I see that Catherine wants to take the floor again. Of course, you're free to do so. But before giving the floor to you, I would like to request if any other speakers want to take the floor, because we are coming to an end for this webinar today. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to thanks, Mario, for bringing in these points, and I think especially the point on asylum and migration, because I think it's a good example to also make very clear how we need to stay alert on allyship and kind of being cohesive in our approaches, because the reality also is that we have seen far-right forces using LGBTI rights against the rights of migrants and asylum seekers, using women's rights against the rights of asylum seekers, for example. So in our election pledge, for example, that we had for the European elections now, where we asked candidates to sign up to work together with LGBTI organizations against polarization, against hate, to advance LGBTI rights on EU level, we had a disclaimer to say we only accept candidates who actually adhere to human rights framework. And we did that specifically because we know that there are certain conservative far-right parties that will argue that to protect LGBTI rights, you need to actually limit migration and the rights of refugees, who will argue that in Berlin you used to be able to walk hand in hand as a same-sex couple, and this is no longer possible because of the increase of migrants and foreigners, for example, in a city like Berlin. So we also have a really clear call for ourselves to stand very, very clear that we're not accepting any of these arguments, that we're actively standing against these arguments together with organizations working on the rights of refugees, and that we're really clearly pointing out how all the policies undermining asylum seekers' rights, all the fast tracking, all the outsourcing that we're seeing is disproportionately undermining the rights of refugees from vulnerable groups, including LGBTI refugees, but many, many others as well. So I just wanted to add that, and thanks for bringing that to the conversation.
Thank you, Catherine, for your response to this point made by Mario. Jeffrey, and then Sandro.
Just a very small point to build on Mario and Catherine. At the IUF's Congress last year, in our resolution on LGBTI rights, we introduced for the first time the idea of using an intersectional approach in doing this work. And at our last executive committee meeting, we did a panel with a group of folks talking from different perspectives about the need for an intersectional approach, particularly when talking about LGBTI rights. And, our general secretary often says, if you take the women, the LGBTI, the young workers, the migrant workers, we're really at a supermajority at that point. And so it is truly in the interests of the labor movement to sort of embrace all of these communities and to think about them together and to not erase their differences, but to understand that they are part of, a sort of complex situation for workers. So just wanted to introduce that idea. We're going to be doing a training for all of our affiliates later this year on what is intersectionality, what is an intersectional approach in the trade union context. And I can definitely let folks know about that if you're interested. Thanks.
Thanks to you for introducing us to the intersectional debate, which is absolutely important and relevant. Yes, because if we take that approach, we are indeed a majority, so we can win the battle. Sandro, if you feel like you want to talk in Italian, do so, and I will translate.
No, I can try in English. I don't know. Just a short reflection about what Mario said. Mario said that the far-right government in Italy is far from thinking about the children of surrogacy. Actually, is a worse situation because the Italian government want to promote a law that punishes the parents of same-sex children in a situation in which the surrogacy was realized in countries in which it's possible. It's a strange thing from a point of view legal too, but it is a big stigmatization of this person, and because of it, I think is more important than that trade union with the collective bargaining recognize rights to that parents, not just to give rights to this person, but for promoting a better situation for those families. Just this. Thank you. I hope
thank you.
It was clear.
Thank you, Sandro. Excellent point and excellent English. Well, I think it was clearly understood by everyone, your message, and it adds on the worries that we have put on the table today. It's time to close our webinar. I would like to thank the speakers again, Daniel Bertosa, Catherine Hugendupo, and of course, Sandro Galitu from CGIL to be with us. I would also like to thank all the people who are joining us via the platform and the Collectiva streaming, and our technicians who made the live streaming possible. There will be more events, especially the next webinar of the International Trade Union Anti-Fascist Network will be focusing on the rise of the far right in Africa this time. And you have seen maybe already the results of the elections in South Africa, which raise concern also for the LGBTQI community there. It's one of the very few countries in the continent where there is a recognition of LGBTQI rights there. So there is a direct threat to those minorities and groups as well, not only in terms of LGBTQI community and others. So we will come back to you with more information about the African webinar soon. And thank you for following this webinar today.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.